Hi, boys and girls. I'm going to read Chapter 7 of Mrs. Roopy is Loopy. This one is called One Small Step for Man. By this time, we weren't sure if Johnny Appleseed and George Washington had been to our school, or if it was just Mrs. Roopy dressed up in funny costumes. But we were sure of one thing. Mrs. Roopy is Loopy. We have to have proof, Michael said. My father is a policeman, and he said that if you want to be sure of something, you have to have proof. He always says, the proof is in the pudding. What does pudding have to do with it? I asked. Beats me, said Michael. Your dad is weird, I said. How are we going to prove that Mrs. Roopy is dressing up in funny costumes? Ryan asked. We'll get her fingerprints, Michael said, all excited. That's what my dad does. Everybody in the whole world has different fingerprints. If we get Johnny Appleseed's fingerprints, and then we get Mrs. Roopy's fingerprints, I can have my dad test them. If they are the same fingerprints, then that will be proof that Mrs. Roopy was just pretending to be Johnny Appleseed. Me and Ryan agreed that Michael was a genius. The next time we had library, we brought a juice box with us so we could get Mrs. Roopy's fingerprints. But when we came into the library, all the lights were out and the shades were down. It was really dark. At first, we thought the library was closed. Then we heard a noise. It came from the top of the treehouse. We all looked up. Somebody was coming down the ladder. Whoever it was had on a spacesuit and was moving in slow motion. Some music began playing over the loudspeaker. The Eagle has landed, the astronaut said. Finally, the astronaut reached the bottom rung of the ladder. It was hard to see a face through the space helmet. It's got to be Mrs. Roopy, Andrea said. I'm not Mrs. Roopy, the astronaut said. My name is Neil Armstrong. It is 1969. I am about to become the first human being to set foot on the moon. Slowly, Neil Armstrong put one foot on the floor of the library. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind, he said. We tried to convince Neil Armstrong that he was really Mrs. Roopy dressed in a spacesuit, but he kept saying he'd never heard of anyone named Roopy. Neil Armstrong spent the rest of the period showing us books about the moon and the sun and the stars and outer space. It was almost not boring, but not quite. Would you like some juice, Mr. Armstrong? Michael asked, holding out the juice box. No, thank you, Neil Armstrong said. I've got to be getting back to Earth now, and I believe you have to go back to Miss Daisy's class. Then he climbed up the ladder and into the treehouse. Michael was disappointed he didn't get Neil Armstrong's fingerprints. When we got back to class, I told Miss Daisy all about Neil Armstrong stepping on the surface of the moon for the first time. Wow, that sounds exciting, Miss Daisy said. Do you still think books are boring, AJ? Yes, I said. Stay tuned for Chapter 8.